Hello, this is a presentation about feudalism, its governance, and warfare by Alana Rood, Joseph Palladino, Joseph Willard, and Nicholas Westcott. Feudalism was an arrangement of government in the Middle Ages structured through a system of hierarchy based off of the exchange of land and services. The topics we will discuss are the methods of government in feudal societies, the relationships between lords and vassals, the role of serfs in the feudal society, and the structure and execution of warfare in European feudalism. The government of feudal societies formed after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire protected its citizens, but after its fall in 1476, there was no centralized government to do so. This left the poor especially vulnerable to civil disorder and invading barbarians. Local lords filled that void in feudal societies, providing protection and land to the poor. In turn, the poor paid a high rent to these lords and provided services to them, such as farming the land and sometimes fighting in wars. The serfs were completely dependent upon their lords and, in many cases, could not leave them, though they were technically not slaves as they couldn't be bought or sold. A large fortified manor house, belonging to the lord and his family, was usually surrounded by a small village of huts and cottages where the serfs lived. This was surrounded by farmland which was cared for by the serfs. These villages were also characterized by small local economies and subsistence farming. The king alone reigned above the lords. Europe developed several forms of feudalism throughout the Middle Ages. Because feudal societies could vary by location, there was no one fixed system. Feudalism emerged first in France in the 9th and 10th centuries, as land, which had been granted to lords by the king, began to be passed down hereditarily. These lords gained power. They developed their own justice system, set their own taxes, and minted their own money. They still owed taxes and military service to the king, however, so the lords in turn rented out their land to peasants. These peasants farmed the land and paid taxes to the lord. France had one of the longest-lasting feudal societies, not being truly abolished until after the French Revolution of the 17th century. Feudalism was brought to England by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. English feudalism closely followed the French system, with peasants receiving land holdings in exchange for labor. However, after the populations of England were decimated by the plague in the 14th century, peasants began to revolt, leading to the decline of feudalism. Feudalism also spread to Germany, where it was mixed with the typical clan societies of the Germanic kingdoms. Unlike France and England, where many of the peasants were serfs with very little freedom, most of the German peasants were tenant farmers who paid a share of their harvest to the lord as rent. Like in England, feudalism began to decline in Germany in the 14th century. A vassal's oath of fealty meant they were sworn to their lord in various ways. Vassals provided counsel when called upon and were trusted with their lord's most valuable secrets. Whether it came to deciding a criminal sentence or a matter as simple as farming, vassals were their lord's valuable advisors. Vassals were also bound to provide military aid and pledge homage to their lord, in which they swore submission and utmost fidelity. Vassals could withdraw their service, but only in certain circumstances. For example, a vassal could withdraw his service if their lord took counsel against their life, committed adultery with their spouse, or attacked them. Likewise, lords were sworn to their vassals. Lords granted their vassals fiefs, an income of sorts that allowed a vassal to support themselves in exchange for their servitude. Fiefs were typically in the form of a plot of land with a number of peasants, otherwise known as serfs. Lords vowed to protect their vassals from any harm and defend them in court, and they had the right to try a vassal for treachery if they did not serve honorably, which was a felony in feudalistic Europe. This felony was so severe that it could end in the vassal's death, or at the very least, they would be stripped of their fiefs. Lords in later instances could only call upon their vassal's service 40 days out of the year. The serf's lifestyle consisted of jobs and living. The lords and nobles would offer protection, land, and food in exchange for the serfs' labor and a portion of the crops they produced in the farms. Western Europe was constantly invaded by raiders and Vikings, so protection was an important factor in the serf's life. The serfs were tethered to the land they resided in and could not leave unless they had permission from their lord, which was rare. They lived in mucky, poor villages because they were a part of the lowest class in the Middle Ages and did not own anything. The serfs, however, had concealed value. They were the backbone of the Middle Age economy. Without the serfs, there would be no one producing crops, and with no crops, there would be no food for the lords, nobles, kings, and the lords' armies. The upper classes' wealth depended on the amount of crop production from the serfs. Although this was the case, the peasants and serfs received no credit for their labor because they had no rights and didn't own anything. Medieval Europe was a dangerous place. Therefore, militarism was an intrinsic part of the pragmatic necessity of feudal governance. Historical evidence suggests that most feudal armies were smaller than one might imagine, numbering in 2 or 3 figures. If a lord built an army, it was largely composed of loyal vassals and accompanied by their followers. These followers were often personal militaries attached to the household of the vassal or other small landowners. Charlemagne's way of raising troops among his vassals also incorporated a fine levied against those who chose to remain home instead of following those who went to war, referred to in primary sources as the Haribano. Occasionally, mercenaries were preferred over domestic forces to wage war. In these situations, lords and kings decreed that a monetary sum be paid from each knight's fief to support the employ and pay of these soldiers. Mustering of large militia composed of small landowners and serfs did happen, but was rare. Warfare was conducted in 2 primary ways: defense from invaders and civil war, and offensive foreign campaigns. These defensive postures were organized between vassals and lords and were expected to be formed by every able-bodied free man coming to the defense of his home. Foreign campaigns were spearheaded by specialized armies, helmed by a king or lord, often undertaking years-long campaigns like the Crusades. These armies were ruled over by their commanders with strict discipline. Emperor Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire created a set of rules for his army governed by a pragmatic and even moral code. For example, soldiers weren't allowed to cause strife with one another for the sake of peace within the conjoined forces. They were also prohibited from setting fire to villages and houses they encountered, and could receive severe punishment for robbing a church or market. In conclusion, a lack of centralized government led to the control of local lords, who delegated loyal vassals to support them in exchange for fiefs of land. Feudalism was a militaristic arrangement, where lords and vassals pledged to support one another in times of crisis. These pledges of land and life were supported by serfs, who worked the fiefs to support themselves and their lords. Vassals composed the armies of lords who fought each other, abroad, and the defense of their collective lands. We hope you learned something about the characteristics of European feudalism from this presentation. On behalf of Alana, Joseph, and Joseph, thank you for watching.